Chapter 2. The Boss. As the hands of the large clock on the wall neared midnight, Professor Pomekin grew visibly more agitated. The boss, as he was known to his many colleagues at the clinic behind his back, could no longer relax in the comfortably padded chair behind the desk in the tastefully decorated office. At this very moment, the accident should be taking place. Would he finally be rid of Buteyko for good? Why on earth had he lured him away from the academician Daryev's team in 1958? He should have let Daryev deal with the brazen upstart in Moscow. His wings would have quickly been clipped in the capital. But here in Siberia, the professor unconsciously flailed his arms as he paced the carpet runner. Here they had been forced to resort to extreme measures. But what else could he do? What else could he do when his Nobel Prize hung in the balance? It wasn't just a hypothetical Nobel Prize. It was the Nobel Prize that he, Professor Pomekin, stood a good chance of winning very soon. And before he had even turned 45, the professor examined himself in the round mirror on the wall. He was of medium height, broad-shouldered and well-built. He wore a goatee beard and was still popular among the ladies. It was true that he wasn't as breathtakingly handsome as the slim and athletic Buteyko, but all the same. And what were the attentions of the fairer sex to the doctor? Buteyko didn't seem to be interested in anything but his equipment. With his wife and small daughter in Moscow, he could have enjoyed a little diversion here in the provinces. But no, he sat from morning to night with his combine complexator. Oh, that complexator. The professor ground his teeth. He stood for a moment at the window that looked onto the dark hospital garden, adjusting the crisp white coat that had begun to slip off untidily. From his position on the second floor, he could see the delicate raindrops left by a recent shower on the green leaves of the poplar as they glistened in the yellow lamplight. The perfume of the fresh May evening was slightly heady. But Pomekin didn't care about the scents of spring. How wonderful and simple his life had been before he had met that impudent upstart. The professor slapped his knee in agitation. Pomekin had been born into a good family, graduated from medical school, then gained his Ph.D. exceptionally early. He made good use of his parents' connections in the early years. It would have been impossible to make headway in the scientific world otherwise. Pomekin quickly formed his own network of contacts, acquired a degree of polish, and began to feel at home in this world where each was a friend, colleague, and brother, as the Soviet saying had it. He was soon awarded the prestigious postdoctoral qualification of Doctor of Sciences. Everything came easily. He was a talented surgeon and enjoyed operating, achieving a certain fame as a cardiologist, then becoming a professor before the age of 40. It was about time to become director of his own institute, but it was hard to stand out in Moscow among so many eminent surgeons. Then, at the end of the 1950s, the Communist Party began a campaign to bring science to Siberia, and Khrushchev appealed to the scientific elite to help develop the far-flung regions of the taiga. Gradually, scientists started to move to Siberia, some of them famous specialists from Moscow and Leningrad, but many more who were as yet unknown and eager for recognition. There were good scientists and bad. Some were seeking absolute power, and others were true patriots. Pomekin got down to work. There, some 30 kilometers from Novosibirsk in the frozen expanses of Siberia, he stood a real chance of establishing his own institute, his own impregnable fortress. A Siberian branch of the Soviet Academy of Sciences was set up with generous funding, and everyone leapt at the chance to join its staff. The young professor had long dreamt of founding an experimental medical institute with a biological slant. In 1958, it seemed his dream was about to come true. While Pomekin was still in Moscow, one of his colleagues brought Dr Buteyko to meet him. He's not working with us at the moment. He's actually in Academician Daryev's department, but he might have been made for us," said the colleague of the quietly self-contained Buteyko. "He's also fighting for truth and has lots of promising plans." They talked for over an hour. Buteyko openly spoke about his growing conflict with his supervisor. Daryev was a renowned expert and did not believe that hypertension could be treated in a new way, and not just with tablets and injections as it had previously. Buteyko described the wonderful diagnostic laboratory that he'd set up in the department, and how it had been taken away from him because of this dispute. He told Pomekin about his hopes for the future. Pomekin took to Buteyko with his spiritual face and unaffected sincerity. His views on the inadequacy of modern equipment struck a chord in the professor. He wanted to have such a skilled artist working with him, but as a technical expert and not a dangerous scientific rival. Buteyko hardly seemed to pose a threat. Pomekin was a professor and a cardiologist, whereas Buteyko was a lowly researcher without Pomekin's esteemed postgraduate qualifications. The doctor was part physician, part gynecologist and obstetrician. What rivalry could there be? If Buteyko was an artist, he was a peasant artist. Pomekin promised the doctor everything: staff, money for equipment, and a laboratory. They found that they generally agreed about everything, and at first, after the move to Novosibirsk, Pomekin had no regrets. They were temporarily allocated the old TB block on the grounds of the city hospital. From the very first, Buteyko was intent on assembling his unusual equipment, but in the beginning he didn't bother anyone. On the contrary, he was a great help. When a piece of equipment broke down in a neighbouring department and no one could fix it, they called Buteyko. He would inevitably get it up and running again quickly. Apart from the fact that Buteyko had graduated brilliantly from the country's top medical school and started a postgraduate degree under the renowned academician Daryev's supervision, he was also a gifted technician. Buteyko and his assistants spent 15 hours a day constructing his combine complexator. Pomekin frowned at the very thought of that unusual diagnostic apparatus. It was almost ready by the autumn of 1960, and as the work on it neared completion, the first signs of disagreement between Buteyko and the professor appeared. According to Buteyko, that confounded upstart, the complexator was a unique piece of medical technology with no equivalent either in the USSR or abroad. The patient lay on a special couch and was hooked up to a variety of sensors that, according to Buteyko, provided information inconceivable in any other clinic in the world. The complexator could simultaneously provide data on up to 40 indicators of the patient's condition: pulse rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and even the amount of carbon dioxide present in an inhalation and exhalation were all measured by the cunning device. It could also measure carbon dioxide levels separately in the lungs and blood. And it was then that Buteyko showed just what he was capable of. The diagnoses made with the aid of this infamous complexator directly contradicted the opinions of the top specialists in the professor's clinic, people who had spent years honing their diagnostic skills. The first victim was the head of the physiology laboratory, Mayor Shikman. "You have pseudo-physiologists here, not physiologists," Buteyko said bluntly to the professor. But the worst was... Pomekin stopped pacing to glance at the clock. The hands had already passed midnight. The worst was... Buteyko was right. The professor would never forget the cold, frosty autumn morning in 1960 when Elvira Samuilovna, Shikman's top radiologist, had presented the laboratory findings for one of the most difficult cases. "It's pulmonary stenosis," she announced categorically, spreading out the glossy celluloid X-rays in front of her. "The only possible way to save this patient is an urgent heart operation," said the pink and plump Shikman, nodding his bald head knowingly. "What's your opinion?" Pomekin turned towards Buteyko, who was also present at the meeting. The The professor knew Buteyko could not stand the radiologist because of her nasty habit of showing X-rays only to the professor during ward rounds. She would turn her back on Buteyko and furtively produce them from somewhere under her lab coat, then quickly conceal them again. In my opinion, the doctor rose to his feet and wiped his glasses. Now he's going to spout pseudo-physiology, thought the professor, unconsciously smirking to himself, but what he heard instantly banished all irony. In my opinion, surgical intervention is dangerous and extremely undesirable. Buteyko's warning grated on Pomekin, as he couldn't stand such criticism of surgery. As a first-class cardiologist, Pomekin preferred to solve the majority of unclear cases with a scalpel. Although heart surgery was dangerous, the professor did not shy away from risk. He saw this as his duty, his calling, and as a result, no matter what else, he was held in high repute. There were few people at that time who had the courage to touch a living human heart. He was forgiven occasional fatalities. In cardiology they couldn't be avoided, but every success added another shining jewel to his medical crown. Pomekin couldn't imagine himself without a scalpel, and those who were opposed to the scalpel, even for good reason, became his enemies, whether they knew it or not. "What reasons can you give for your diagnosis?" Pomekin had turned slightly pink. "We have X-rays." He nodded towards the glowering radiologist, who was agitatedly fingering the celluloid pictures. "At the end of the day, an electrocardiogram—" "Exactly." The unwieldy sheikman jumped to his feet, beads of sweat on his meaty nose. "Explain, Dr Buteyko, and don't talk nonsense. This diagnosis has been established by the physiology laboratory, and as its head I insist—" "Insist as much as you like." Buteyko adjusted his glasses again and from his coat pocket pulled a long strip of paper with curved lines plotted on it. "You have an electrocardiogram," the doctor emphasized the first word, "and we investigate heart function using a ballistocardiograph. You understand?" He looked with ill-disguised contempt at the head of the laboratory. "A ballistocardiograph is 10 times more exact." "Hold on!" Meyer Sheikman flung his arms up in irritation. "Who has proved that it's 10 times more exact? Such insolence!" Sheikman couldn't restrain himself any longer. "You've not long got your equipment together, your so-called complexator." Sheikman turned to Pomekin for support. "But electrocardiograms are used throughout the world." "That means they're being used to no purpose," interrupted Buteyko. He wasn't finding it easy to argue with these pompous authorities, but he had no intention of backing down. "But what if your theory is disproved when we open him up? Do you understand the responsibility you're taking upon yourself?" The professor's reddish eyes were fixed on Buteyko's face, its stony expression making him still more handsome. "It's lunacy to crack open a patient's chest just to confirm such a clear-cut diagnosis by the ballistocardiograph," thought Buteyko, feeling weak at the knees. But, on the other hand, better the butchers did that than slice at the heart. An operation would mean certain death for this patient. It could have helped if it were pulmonary stenosis, right ventricular outflow obstruction, but for mitral valve insufficiency, that is, if the valve was not closing properly, surgical intervention would be deadly. "Well?" Pomekin continued to fix Buteyko with a stare. Sheikman held his breath, suddenly afraid. But what if Buteyko was right? "I normally know what I'm talking about," answered Buteyko, slowly but clearly. They opened up the chest of the poor patient, who was thin as a rake and barely alive in any case. Pomekin inserted his finger into the incision, felt the posterior commissure, and now, realizing that Buteyko's diagnosis was correct, brusquely ordered his assistants. "Sew him up." The day after this episode, Sheikman was no longer head of the laboratory, but his successor continued to wrongly diagnose cases of pulmonary stenosis. They needlessly opened up the chests of a few more patients, and unpleasant rumours spread through the wards. These doctors cut patients open like lambs to the slaughter, people were saying, without even examining them. Buteyko's diagnoses were extremely unwelcome to Permakin, as they limited the scope of his surgical activities. At first he got angry and started threatening the doctor, but after he was proved wrong on 3 occasions when he had explored patients' chests, he pretended to have made his peace with the great diagnostician. "How does it work, this wretched ballistocardiograph?" he asked Buteyko, with a fake smile one day when they were alone. "How does it achieve such exact results compared with a normal electrocardiogram?" "It's not just a ballistocardiograph," said the doctor, who lit up at the question. "It's my own special design. It's calibrated. There aren't any others like it in the world." "Oh, let's have less of this whole world," the professor said coldly. "To listen to you, you're God's gift to medicine, and everyone else just mutilates their patients." "Not quite everyone." The doctor's finely drawn face lost its animation. "But many people. A great many at the moment." He raised his head as if in challenge. "Let's take that electrocardiogram, which seems to provoke some kind of mass hysteria. Have a think, Professor. What kind of information does it give you?" Buteyko pulled off his white cap and pushed back his unruly forelock. "It records the electrical impulse the heart muscle makes when it contracts," Buteyko continued, answering his own question. He tapped his right temple with his crooked forefinger in indignation. "The same impulse that is generated by the sinoatrial node. So what?" He abruptly lowered his crooked arm. "What does this picture of heart function give us? It's as if we were looking at the ignition to check how the engine was working. It isn't a reliable indicator at all. The ignition works, so the mixture is ignited, but we can't use that to measure the power of the engine. Similarly, the graph of the electric impulse is hardly a reliable indication of heart function." Seeing how mistrustfully the professor was looking at him, the doctor became visibly nervous. "The ballistocardiograph is quite another matter, especially my calibrated design. It measures the real function of the heart, its role as a hydraulic pump." To Permakin it seemed that Buteyko's very ears had turned pink with excitement. "As a hydraulic pump," repeated Buteyko for emphasis. "After all, what does the heart do? It circulates blood, and so the force with which it does that is an important indicator of its health. The calibrated ballistocardiograph uses sensors to detect the slightest displacement of the chest every time blood is expulsed, on every impulse generated by the heart pump, and it provides an exact graph of these displacements. By interpreting this graph, we get an absolutely accurate picture of how the most important vital organ is functioning. This is why an electrocardiogram shows you pulmonary stenosis, and the ballistocardiograph gives a completely different diagnosis." "Interesting," said the professor, apparently lost in thought and gazing somewhere behind Buteyko's shoulder. "Very—" he coughed into his fist. "Interesting. Well, let's suppose you're right. The patient doesn't have pulmonary stenosis, and an operation would be dangerous." The professor pulled a long face. "What would you suggest? What can replace the scalpel? Tablets and injections, as a rule, don't work on my patients." For a few seconds neither man spoke, as if biding their time. "I use carbon dioxide instead of the scalpel," said Buteyko, with quiet conviction. "You've already told me this nonsense." Permakin pulled away. "Can't you make a more serious suggestion? Carbon dioxide," Permakin drew a circle in the air, "is like a genie in a bottle. It's virtually impalpable, and its benefits for patients are practically impossible to prove." Buteyko's cheekbones stood out more sharply. "What's the point of empty chit-chat?" In his anger, the doctor had forgotten about rank. "Let's go to the complexator. I hope you won't need practical proof of your own angina." As the boss arranged himself on the complexator's couch, Buteyko's subordinates exchanged sly glances. "Breathe more deeply," the doctor ordered the professor, who was covered with sensors. Pomekin inhaled. After only a minute he was racked by a dry cough. The ballistocardiograph dispassionately recorded a severe attack of angina. "Now, switch to shallow breathing." To the professor, the doctor's voice seemed to be coming from far away. Red circles were dancing in front of his eyes, but as he began to breathe less deeply, Pomekin started to feel a noticeable improvement. "Is that better?" Buteyko leant over him. The professor nodded his head. "Give him a little carbon dioxide." The doctor turned to his assistant. "How is it now?" He again leant over Pomekin. "Sheer bliss," replied the professor, smiling contentedly and nodding his goatee. "It's as if the attack never happened." "So, can carbon dioxide replace the scalpel?" Buteyko asked the professor when he was on his feet again. Pomekin's large dark pupils narrowed. "In certain circumstances, possibly," he muttered, with a worried glance at the assistant standing nearby. "And in your case as well," remarked Buteyko as loudly as possible. "And in case you forget, we'll keep a file of your graphs from the complexator." He nodded to his assistant. "Put the best ones in, Oleg." Mutin stood to the right, keeping a close eye on the assistant as he filed the graphs. So, this was how the conflict between Pomekin and Buteyko had come to a head. As he recalled these episodes, the professor had glanced several times at the clock and the massive telephone receiver. It was after 1:30, but the telephone had not rung. What had happened? Pomekin had a nasty feeling in the pit of his stomach. Was Mutin still alive? After all, it was a car accident. Was it really possible to plan everything in advance? Pomekin wiped his clammy forehead with his hand. His decision to physically eliminate the doctor had not come immediately. Murder, however you looked at it, was still murder. The idea had developed gradually. After his own examination by the complexator, he had realized that Buteyko was right, absolutely right, which meant that his discovery of the diseases of deep breathing was a real scientific discovery. And what a discovery! Hippocrates and Avicenna would envy it. According to Buteyko, 150 of the most common diseases could be cured in a single stroke without tablets, injections, or surgery. Bronchial asthma, all sorts of allergies, ischemia, angina pectoris, the scourge of the 20th century diabetes, preeclampsia, miscarriage, and more. Alas, it seemed that Buteyko, that peasant artist, had vanquished all these diseases. But if that was the case, what would happen to Pomekin and his Nobel Prize? He treated heart complaints with the scalpel and had been one of the first to treat particularly severe cases of bronchial asthma by cutting out, then reattaching one of the lungs. He hoped to win the cherished Nobel Prize for this operation once it became more widely used. He had already removed several lungs and sewn them back in place, although it was true that he did not reconnect the nerve endings that had been severed from their roots. Whether the asthmatic patient's condition improved after this operation was, of course, a problematic question. But no therapy really worked for asthmatics. As the Russian saying goes, only death can straighten a hunchback. And the operation had worked wonders for his reputation. The respected scientist, Professor Pomekin, is undaunted by risk and travels the unbeaten track. That's what they'd written about him. And they would write more. They would write more, as long as there were no discoveries by Buteyko. Pomekin seized the ringing telephone, but it was a false alarm. This discovery was so new, why not wait a little longer, he subtly suggested to Buteyko, and dropped hints about his Nobel Prize. But the doctor remained obdurate. He wasn't stupid, it was true, not one bit. He knew how to handle the situation. Seeing the conversation was frank and serious, he did not beat around the bush, but made Pomekin a direct offer of co-authorship. He'd not discovered the diseases of deep breathing alone, he said. They'd made the discovery together. Yes, whatever else, Buteyko knew how to get what he wanted. Not everyone would be capable of sharing the discovery of the century, but Buteyko was. He would do anything to get his discovery the green light. The torrent of memories made the back of Pomekin's neck ache. The temptation had been great, very great. They could take Moscow by storm with the method for the elimination of deep breathing, and worldwide fame and recognition would be ensured for years to come. Just the numbers saved from suffocating attacks of asthma, tens of millions in the USSR alone, would give them gold statues in their honor, and the numbers saved from angina and diabetes would ensure their pedestals were covered with mountains of flowers. The temptation was great. Pomekin touched his aching neck with his hot palm. However, there had been one huge but. The strength of opposition from the medical establishment if there was any attempt to introduce this method into their daily practice. For example, he could cut out a bronchial asthmatic's lung. Whether good or bad, it was action, visible, palpable, clear to everyone, and exceptionally brave. And what was Buteyko doing? Instead of having an extraordinary operation, the asthmatic decreased the depth of his own breathing. And that was all. Who on earth would believe that? Well, patients with asthma and angina would, especially those having attacks, as the attacks would disappear. But what about those who had to write an official scientific report based on empirical evidence? Would they believe it? Never. The patients weren't taking any medicine or getting any injections or even any operations. And suddenly they were getting better. The professionals would put it down to anything else, temporary hypnosis, short-term autosuggestion, but they wouldn't believe it, nor would they confirm it. Knowing this, Pomekin overcame the temptation. He refused the offer of co-authorship outright, especially as it would automatically turn his Institute of the Scalpel into the Institute of Carbon Dioxide. The professor could not imagine himself without a scalpel, and did not want to. Needless to say, his concern for the development of medicine and the good of patients went by the board. He had to consider his own interests first, after all. So he answered Buteyko with a flat no, asked him not to make any presentations to the Scientific Council of the Siberian branch of the Academy of Sciences, and told him to drop this absurd idea. However, that had no effect. On the 11th of October of the previous year, the confounded man had stood on the platform waving a pointer as he introduced his complexator machine to an audience of surgeons. For a long time, these blasted specialists had turned up their noses, but their ears were still open. Once in a while they began looking into the precious complexator's room as if they were passing by chance. Some even wanted to be examined by it. Of course, Buteyko was shot down by the Academy. It was too early to announce the discovery. The complexator was still very new, but that was only for the time being. What would happen in future? That might be much worse. So Pomekin felt he had no choice. He had to act. To begin with, he ordered Andrei Mutin to steal the file containing the records of his own examination by the complexator, which Andrei had managed to do. He was a reliable chap, whatever else, and faithful as a dog. He would sell his own grandmother to further his career. Then the doctor started to experience bouts of food poisoning. The assistant had arranged this himself, showing initiative, so to speak. True, not without encouragement from his superior, but he'd do anything for science. Pomekin had remarked in passing that sometimes people were poisoned by mushrooms, and, as if by magic, Buteyko was soon complaining to Andrei about terrible vomiting. Andrei felt sorry for him, naturally. Buteyko was a friend and colleague. They shared accommodation. But the car accident, that was purely Andrei's idea. The doctor had helped more and more patients with his shallow breathing techniques. It even looked as if he was managing to delay patient deaths. Mutin saw how terribly his boss was suffering and how he was eaten up with worry. As if talking about someone else, he jokingly described a semi-fantastic scenario, as he put it. Mutin said that he dreamt that on the way back from Akademgorodok, where they often went, the bus had suddenly broken down on the road, either for mechanical reasons or because someone had suggested to the driver, "Let's pull up for a couple of hours, mate. My mother-in-law promised to come by and I really don't want to see her." Or maybe no one had said anything to the driver. Maybe someone had loosened a couple of little screws in the engine before setting off, while the driver had dashed to the cafeteria, and the engine died before they got home. It's amazing what rubbish you dream. You can't remember all the details afterwards. But, interestingly, Mutin remembered the ending quite well. He was with someone in a jeep late in the evening, travelling from the station, because there were no taxis. Then all of a sudden, bang, there was a terrible collision. He woke up in a sweat, shaking. Pomekin remarked that there was less risk if you sat in the back. Andrei replied, "I dreamt that my cousin Mishka was at the wheel. He's been living here for 2 years and drives a jeep for a living. He was sacked from his last job for drinking. That's why he came to Novosibirsk." Such was Mutin's dream. Then, on the 14th of April, Buteyko announced to everyone in his laboratory that in a month he would be killed, and asked them to listen to his scientific testament. The professor cracked his fingers. What a visionary they had here. Buteyko could sense what was brewing. But the date when the wretch had made the announcement was the most important, a day of national rejoicing, the day after Yuri Gagarin had flown into space. It was incredible. People were glued to loudspeakers and televisions as they listened to congratulations from all over the world. The sick rose from their beds. A Soviet citizen was the first man in space. But Buteyko was announcing his death and asking his colleagues to write his testament down. Well, Buteyko was hoisted by his own petard. He had announced his own death. Mutin had understood this and reported back to Pomekin straight away. He concluded that they couldn't possibly let the great diagnostician down. His prophecies had to come true. But yesterday Mutin had muttered that he had a bad feeling, as if he would perish in this accident along with the man who had foretold it. The fateful day was the 15th of May, the end of Buteyko's allotted span, and he gazed pensively at Pomekin. So the professor had decided to sit and wait into the night. Anything could happen. Pomekin had faith in Mutin's abilities, as Andrei knew that the boss's gratitude would have no bounds if he was successful. But it wasn't a simple matter to get such a troublemaker out of the way of science. Would they succeed? Pomekin noticed that the hands of the clock were both pointing to 1 and sighed heavily. His attempts, for example, to get Buteyko put in a lunatic asylum had come to nothing. The Regional Communist Party Committee and even the KGB had cut him short when he sidled in with his suggestions. The professor briefly ceased his pacing, and his round cheeks turned crimson. He wouldn't forget for a long time how one of the highest-placed officials in the region had stamped his foot when he'd heard Pomekin ask for help in placing a young scientist who was insanely obsessed with carbon dioxide in a lunatic asylum. "1 Buteyko is worth the whole of your clinic, the entire experimental institute," the angry party secretary had yelled. "I don't want to hear about this again." Pomekin had not expected such a reception, but without Communist Party support there could be no question of a psychiatric hospital. And, pathetic as it might seem, it was the professor himself who had first introduced the official to Buteyko when work on the ill-starred complexator was finished. Pomekin had wanted to show off the new machine. The professor didn't know how the doctor managed to bewitch the party official, but now Buteyko had the official's approval. Pomekin could not go above his head. Pomekin once again paced the coloured carpet runner from the door to the desk and back. Of course, party approval was not required for a car crash, and Mutin was right. But Mutin's mushrooms hadn't worked. The sharp, sudden ring of the telephone rent the night silence of the cosy office. To the dumbstruck professor, it sounded like the crack of a whip. "We were in an accident. We barely escaped with our lives." Pomekin dimly made out Mutin's muffled voice in the distance through the crackling of the receiver. "A car behind us." Half an hour later he heard uneven footsteps in the corridor, and Buteyko appeared at the door, which had been carefully left ajar. He was supported by Mutin, and purple bruising was visible through the gauze bandage on his pale face. The professor almost fainted.